The night my mom tried to erase me from Christmas, I found the one thing she never meant for me to see. Hi, I'm Amber, and I'm 34 years old. I always thought Christmas was unbreakable in our family, even when everything else felt fragile. My mom hosted it every year, no matter what mood she was in or who she was upset with. So when she calmly told me not to come this year, like it was a scheduling issue, not a heartbreak, something shifted quietly inside me. She said it like a favor, like she was protecting me from tension I hadn't created. I stood in her kitchen pretending to understand while my hands trembled around a coffee mug I didn't even want. We've had disagreements before, but never exile. Never this clean, this cold. As I walked back to my car, snow starting to fall, I couldn't stop wondering what had finally pushed her this far. At first, I told myself to respect it. I wrapped gifts for my niece anyway, then hid them in my closet like a guilty secret. Every instinct told me to call her and fight, but I felt strangely tired of always being the one to reach back. Christmas lights appeared on every house except mine. I sat alone one night, staring at them through my window, feeling like I'd already been written out. A few days later, she texted asking if I could stop by to pick up something I'd left months ago. Her wording was careful, stiff, like each word had been inspected. When I arrived, the house smelled like cinnamon and pine, just like always. For a moment, I imagined she'd changed her mind. But she didn't mention Christmas at all, and that silence felt louder than any argument. She went to the garage to look for my old box of childhood papers, and I stayed in the hallway, surrounded by framed photos I suddenly didn't recognize myself in. Then I saw the closet door in her bedroom slightly open. I don't know why I looked in. I just did. On the top shelf sat a small cardboard box with my name written in faded marker. I stood there longer than I should have, my heartbeat louder than the heater clicking on and off. I knew I shouldn't touch it. Still, my hands moved before my courage could catch up. The box felt lighter than I expected when I pulled it down. Inside were envelopes, folded notes, and one wrapped object that looked like it had never been opened at all. The first envelope was a letter I'd written to my mom at 17, the kind of emotional confession teenagers only write once. I had given it to her after a terrible argument, thinking it might change something between us. I always assumed she threw it away. Then I found cards she never delivered to me, dated through the years, each one saying things I never thought she would say. The wrapped object was heavier than the letters. Inside was a small wooden music box I'd made in shop class and given to her for Christmas when I was 15. She had cried that morning, harder than I'd ever seen. After that year, things between us cooled in ways I never fully understood. Holding that box again felt like touching a version of us I didn't know still existed. When she came back inside, she froze when she saw me sitting on her bed with the box in my hands. Her face tightened, but not with anger, with fear. That surprised me more than anything. She didn't yell. She just sat beside me and stared at the floor like it suddenly had answers neither of us wanted to face. She told me she had planned to give me the box after Christmas this year. She said she didn't trust herself to stay composed if I came before then. I asked why she tried to keep me away instead of just saying that. Her voice shook when she admitted that being around me lately made her feel like she was losing control of a story she had told herself for decades. She confessed that she had always seen me as the strong one, the one who didn't need reassurance, the one who would be fine no matter what. And somehow, that idea became an excuse to give more softness to my sister when she was alive, and later to protect her memory in a way that left no room for me. Hearing it didn't fix the ache, but it reshaped it. I told her that being seen as strong all the time felt like being invisible with better packaging, that I didn't need perfection from her, just acknowledgement. The room filled with the ticking of the old wall clock and the faint hum of the heater. For once, neither of us rushed to defend ourselves. We sat inside the truth like it was something new and fragile. She said banning me from Christmas was her attempt at preserving a version of the holiday she had built around absence and memory. She didn't think I would understand sharing space with that. I told her I never had the chance to decide that for myself. Her eyes softened then, not with guilt exactly, but with something closer to release. We opened the rest of the letters together. Some were apologies she never mailed. Others were gratitude she never said out loud. One was dated just weeks earlier, where she admitted she missed the way I used to laugh in the kitchen as a kid. The words weren't perfect or dramatic. They were simple. And somehow that made them heavier in my hands. I asked her directly if she wanted me at Christmas. She hesitated just long enough to tell the truth when she finally answered yes. Not out of obligation, not to fix anything, but because something in her was tired of deciding alone. I told her I wanted to come, not as a symbol, not as a reminder, just as her daughter who still existed in the room. That night I drove home through quiet streets dusted with fresh snow, the box sitting on the passenger seat like a fragile passenger of its own. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steadier, as if a misunderstanding I'd lived inside for years had shifted just enough for light to slip in. The feeling wasn't warm yet, but it wasn't empty either. On Christmas morning, I arrived early. Too early. My mom was still in her robe, hair undone, surprised but not startled when she saw me. We stood awkwardly in the doorway for a few seconds, neither of us moving forward. Then she stepped aside and let me in. No speeches, no apologies. Just the quiet acceptance of shared space returning gently. We made coffee together like we used to. Our movements were careful, like relearning a routine after a long absence. The tree lights flickered on and off as the sun rose through the windows. I placed the music box under the tree without a word. She noticed, but didn't comment. Her silence this time felt respectful, not withholding. When the rest of the day unfolded, it felt smaller than the Christmases of my childhood, but truer. There were no staged smiles for photos, no forced traditions, just conversation that wandered without trying to impress itself. I realized how often we confuse intensity with meaning. That afternoon taught me the difference in a way I wasn't expecting. Later, when we finally opened the box together under the tree, she held the music box carefully and laughed through tears she didn't try to hide. I watched her face soften as the tune played, faint and imperfect. In that moment, I understood how long she had been carrying both love and fear in the same place, without knowing how to separate them. We never fully explained the years that drifted between us. Some distances don't close with answers. They close with presence. That day didn't solve our relationship, but it changed the direction of it. It reminded me that reconciliation doesn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it slips in quietly and waits to be noticed. When I left that night, the snow had stopped, and the street was still. My mom hugged me longer than she had in years, not desperate, not strained, just real. I drove away feeling like something that had been paused inside me had finally resumed, not dramatically, but with steady motion that promised continuity. I still keep the box on a shelf in my living room, not as a symbol of victory or pain, but as proof that people can hold complicated love without knowing how to express it. Sometimes I open it just to remind myself that being unseen doesn't mean unloved, and being excluded doesn't always mean unwanted in the ways we assume. What stays with me most is not the ban, not even the box, but the space between the two. The place where misunderstanding lived quietly until it was given a voice. And how easily years might have passed without that moment if I hadn't reached into a dark closet on an ordinary afternoon when curiosity felt safer than silence. The year after my mom tried to erase me from Christmas, every ordinary moment felt like a quiet test of whether we could really change. Hi, I'm Amber, and if you'd told me a single Christmas could tilt my whole relationship with my mom, I would have laughed and changed the subject. Real life doesn't transform overnight, even when you finally open the box someone has been hiding. But that December cracked something. What came after wasn't dramatic reconciliation, just small, uneasy steps that made every ordinary day feel like a quiet experiment in honesty. I kept wondering what those steps might cost me. January always feels a little hollow after the holidays, but that year it felt almost echoey. The decorations disappeared from porches, yet the awkwardness between my mom and me stayed up like forgotten lights. She called one afternoon, voice too careful, inviting me over for soup because she had more than she could eat. It sounded like an apology translated into logistics, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to accept it. Still, I drove over after work, windshield streaked with leftover road salt and my stomach tightening the closer I got. Her house looked smaller than I remembered, maybe because I wasn't arriving as the default Thanksgiving helper or Christmas co-host. I sat in the car a minute, holding the steering wheel, reminding myself I was allowed to leave if it felt wrong. That choice alone made walking to the door feel different. Inside, the living room looked stripped down without the tree, like the room had taken a deep breath it didn't know what to do with. On the coffee table sat the box from her closet, not hidden anymore, just there between two mismatched coasters. Seeing it out in the open made my chest tighten. It felt like an invitation and a warning at the same time, and I didn't know which to trust. We ate soup at the kitchen table like it was any Tuesday, talking about my job, her neighbor's ugly new fence, my car's ridiculous rattling noise. None of it mattered much, but the tone did. She kept looking at me like she was afraid to push too hard. Finally, she nodded toward the living room and asked if I'd looked inside the box again. I said no, but my curiosity had. In the living room, she sat on the couch and patted the cushion beside her, the way she used to when I was a teenager pretending not to need comfort. She opened the lid and pulled out a new envelope, dated just last week. "You don't have to read this," she said, eyes on her hands. But I needed to write it anyway. My heart thudded, already writing possibilities she hadn't actually said. The letter wasn't dramatic. She wrote about Christmas morning, about how strange it felt to see me walking in with guarded shoulders instead of the bright kid who used to wake everyone up early. She admitted she'd almost told me not to come again and realized, mid-thought, how cruel that sounded. Reading her wrestle with herself on paper felt disorienting. I wasn't used to seeing the hesitation behind her decisions laid out plainly. When I finished, she didn't ask, "So, are we okay now?" like she might have years ago. She just asked what part I got stuck on. I told her the line about wanting to ban me again hurt, but the honesty mattered. Saying that out loud felt like stepping onto thin ice. To my surprise, instead of getting defensive, she nodded slowly, like she'd been expecting that reaction and still chose to be honest. In the weeks that followed, our relationship didn't magically soften. It just shifted 2 degrees at a time. She started texting practical questions. Did I know a good plumber? Was this brand of coffee any good? I answered, then sometimes added little pieces of my life I'd normally keep to myself. A frustrating meeting, a small win at work. Sharing those neutral details felt like testing whether everyday closeness was even possible. Spring brought my niece's birthday, the first family event on the calendar since that complicated Christmas. When my brother texted a group invite, my first instinct was to check if my mom had secretly suggested excluding me again. Old fears have long shadows. Instead, she called me herself and asked if I'd be comfortable coming. Not, "Are you coming?" but, "Would you feel okay being there?" That tiny difference landed deeper than she knew. I told her the truth, that I wanted to see my niece, but I didn't want to walk into a room where I'd be compared to my sister's memory, or measured against invisible expectations. Saying my sister's name out loud still made my chest feel tight, like someone had opened a window in winter. Mom didn't rush to reassure me. She said she understood, and that she'd talk to my brother first. At the party, my niece launched herself at me the second I stepped through the door, frosting on her chin and a paper crown slipping over one eye. In her world, I wasn't the daughter who almost missed Christmas. I was just Aunt Amber, who made silly voices when reading bedtime stories. Being held in that simpler role felt like a relief. My mom watched us from the kitchen doorway, expression complicated but soft. Later, while the kids tore into gifts and my brother argued with the tape dispenser, Mom handed me another small envelope, unsealed this time. "For when you get home," she murmured. She didn't hover, didn't ask if I'd read it right away. That restraint was new. For years, she'd wanted immediate reactions. Now she seemed willing to let my feelings arrive on their own schedule, which felt strangely like respect. That night on my couch, I opened the envelope. The letter was only a few paragraphs long. She wrote about the year my dad left, about how overwhelmed she'd felt trying to hold Christmas together while pretending she wasn't angry. She admitted she'd leaned on me because I was capable, and leaned away from me because my hurt scared her. Seeing those contradictions named made my throat ache in a new, quieter way. Some days after that, I ignored her texts. Not to punish her, but because I needed to feel whether my life still functioned without constant emotional calculations. Other days, I called just to tell her something funny a coworker said. I noticed that when we weren't circling old wounds, we could actually laugh. It wasn't carefree. Too much history hung in the background, but there were moments that felt almost uncomplicated. Those moments surprised me every time. By fall, Christmas showed up again at the edge of conversation like an uninvited guest. Stores put out ornaments before the leaves even finished changing. I caught myself wondering if my mom would assume we'd repeat last year's version, or the banned one. One evening, as we washed dishes at her place, she broke the silence first, asking what I wanted December to look like instead of deciding for me. No one in my family had ever framed a holiday as something I could shape, not just serve. I told her I wanted something smaller. Less performance, fewer guests, more room to breathe. No cousins who loved retelling stories where I came off as the strong one who didn't need help. She listened without arguing, then suggested it be just us, my brother, and my niece. It felt like a manageable experiment in newness. In my apartment, I decorated slowly that year, not out of obligation, but because I wanted my space to feel like mine even if Christmas at Mom's went sideways. I strung simple white lights around the window and bought a small fake tree on sale. As I hung ornaments I'd rescued from her house over the years, I realized I was building my own version of family, one quiet choice at a time. When Christmas Day arrived, the house smelled exactly like it always had. Cinnamon, coffee, something roasting in the oven. But the atmosphere felt different. There was no rush to take perfect pictures or comment on who'd driven the farthest. My mom had placed the box on a bookshelf, not as a centerpiece, not hidden, just present. Its ordinary placement made me feel strangely grounded, like our history didn't have to be either sacred or secret. That night, after my brother left with my sleepy niece and the house grew quiet again, Mom and I sat by the tree with mugs of lukewarm cocoa. She didn't hand me a new letter this time. Instead, she thanked me for coming, in a voice that sounded almost shy. I realized we were both still learning how to be mother and adult daughter, without pretending the past hadn't happened or defined everything. The year my mom and I finally talked about favoritism, it didn't explode like I'd always imagined. It unraveled in small, honest pieces that were somehow harder to ignore. January bled into February, and life went back to its practical rhythms. Work emails, grocery runs, bills on the counter. But something between my mom and me stayed slightly open. Not healed, not raw, just unclosed. I kept thinking about how many decisions she'd made around me instead of with me. That thought followed me into meetings, into laundry day, even into the quiet moments before I fell asleep at night. I wondered if she even noticed the difference. One Saturday morning, she called while I was still in pajamas, hair twisted into a messy bun, coffee half finished on the table. Her voice sounded cautious, but less brittle than before. She asked if I'd help her go through some boxes in the attic, said she was finally ready to sort things. I heard more in that sentence than she probably intended, and curiosity tugged stronger than my hesitation and old resentment. I drove over in leggings and an old sweatshirt, the kind of outfit I would have worn as a teenager when she drafted me into weekend chores. The attic ladder creaked under our weight, like it recognized us. Dust floated in the light from the single small window, giving everything a hazy, almost nostalgic filter that still couldn't soften my memories. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, labeled in her familiar, rushed handwriting. We started with neutral boxes first. Holiday decorations, old kitchen gadgets, my dad's forgotten tools. We made piles for donation, trash, and ask the kids. It felt strangely cooperative, like we were co-managing a life instead of reenacting old roles. Then she pointed toward a corner box simply labeled girls. My stomach tightened. I knew without opening it that whatever waited inside wasn't just about stuff. It was about the way we'd been measured. When I lifted the lid, the first thing I saw was my sister's varsity jacket, folded neatly on top. Beneath it were her school awards, programs from choir concerts, laminated certificates. Off to the side, in a smaller stack, were my things: a few report cards, a faded participation ribbon, one essay with a teacher's handwritten praise. The imbalance wasn't screaming, but it was unmistakable. My chest tightened in a quiet, wordless way. My mom crouched beside me, knees cracking softly, and let out a long breath. "I was afraid of this box," she admitted, surprising me. She picked up my sister's jacket, smoothing the fabric like she always did. "I kept thinking if I touched any of this, I'd lose more of her." I watched her hands and realized they were shaking slightly. The jacket had become more than cloth. It was a script she didn't know how to rewrite. I reached for my small stack, fingers brushing over my name written in a teacher's neat pen. "You didn't lose her by letting me exist next to her," I said, quieter than I expected. The words didn't come out angry. They came out tired. There's a difference. I told her how it felt growing up, how every achievement seemed like an echo of someone who'd done it better first, even when we were just being kids. She didn't argue. That alone felt new. Instead, she asked, almost timidly, what I remembered most clearly. The question caught me off guard. Usually she told her version of events, leaving me to either swallow my disagreement or start a fight. I told her about the Christmas Eve my art project stayed in the hallway while my sister's choir trophy got prime mantle space. It sounded small out loud, but my voice still wobbled. My mom's eyes filled, and for a second I worried we were slipping into familiar territory, her tears becoming the center, my feelings turning into background noise. But she wiped them away quickly and stayed with my story instead of pulling it toward hers. She said she remembered that year completely differently, thought I didn't care about displays or praise. "You never asked," she murmured, and the sentence hung in the attic like dust motes. I told her I stopped asking the day I realized asking made me feel needier than my sister already seemed. My sister's struggles had always been more visible. Anxiety, perfectionism, late-night crying sessions. Mine were quiet, tightening shoulders, late homework because I was helping, jokes made at my own expense. It was easier to let myself become the stable one than admit how heavy that label felt. Saying all that out loud made my throat burn. For a moment, the attic felt too small for everything we'd never said. My mom sat back on an overturned crate, hands folded like she wasn't sure what she was allowed to touch anymore. She admitted she'd leaned on me because I felt safe, and leaned toward my sister because she seemed fragile. "I thought you didn't need the same things," she said slowly, like hearing it in her own voice unsettled her. I realized then that part of my anger came from wanting her to have known better without being told. That felt childish and understandable at the same time. I told her I wasn't asking her to rewrite our history, but I needed her to stop treating my strength as proof I didn't need care. The words didn't come out polished, they tumbled. Still, she stayed quiet long enough for them to land. She picked up one of my old essays and actually read it there, in that dusty attic, lips moving slightly along the lines. When she finished, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite name. Pride, regret, maybe both. "I didn't give this enough attention," she said. No excuses, no "but your sister." Just that simple admission. It felt like someone had cracked a window in a long-closed room. We decided together what to keep. My sister's jacket stayed, but so did my essay. We made a new box, not labeled by girls like a single blended category, but with each of our names written separately on opposite sides. It was a small, almost silly distinction, yet it shifted something in me. For once, it felt like there was physical space carved out where I wasn't just the leftover portion. Driving home that evening, my clothes smelled faintly of dust and old fabric softener. I rolled the window down a little, letting cold air clear my head. I thought about how favoritism doesn't always look like dramatic declarations. Sometimes it's just where things get placed, who gets remembered first, whose story ends up framed. Knowing that didn't fix the past, but it gave me language for the confusion I'd carried for years. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing where I repeated those patterns in my own life. At work, I often took on extra tasks because I was good at handling pressure, then resented being overlooked for recognition. With friends, I became the dependable listener who rarely shared my own mess. It dawned on me that being cast as the strong one had influenced more than my relationship with my mom. It shaped my identity. That realization didn't come with a grand epiphany or dramatic promise to change everything. Instead, I tried one small experiment. I began saying no. I declined a last-minute project at work with a simple, honest explanation instead of scrambling to prove myself. When a friend asked how I was doing, I answered honestly, not just with jokes. Each time, my stomach flipped, waiting for disappointment or rejection that never fully came. On quieter nights, I started journaling, not in a dramatic, Dear Diary way, but in short, honest lists. Things that hurt, things that helped, things I wanted to ask for but didn't. Seeing patterns on the page made them harder to minimize. I noticed how often my first impulse was to apologize before I even formed a request. Naming that habit didn't erase it, but it made it feel less invisible and automatic. One evening, I told my mom about these small experiments over the phone. I expected her to dismiss them as normal or overthinky, but she surprised me. She said she was trying her own quiet adjustments, inviting my brother to handle things she'd always defaulted to me for, asking herself before calling me whether she wanted comfort, advice, or just company. It was strange hearing her describe her own growth without asking me to manage it. As spring edged toward summer, our conversations became less about what had gone wrong and more about what we wanted going forward. Not a perfect relationship, not some Instagram version of mother-daughter closeness, just something honest enough that neither of us had to disappear to keep the peace. I still felt wary sometimes, still braced for old patterns, but there was a softer possibility now, that we might build something new, one small box at a time. By the time summer arrived, I realized rebuilding trust wasn't about what we fixed together, but what I dared to ask for on my own. Summer heat settled in early that year, turning my apartment into a slow oven by mid-afternoon. I worked with the windows open, listening to lawnmowers and kids shouting on the sidewalk. In those long, sticky weeks, I felt restless in a new way. Not unhappy, just unsettled, like I was standing at the edge of something personal I hadn't named yet. The quiet gave me too much space to hear myself thinking. One evening, after hanging up with my mom, I noticed how different our conversations had become. We still talked often, but she no longer filled every pause with advice. She asked more questions, then actually waited for my answers. That waiting felt heavier than I expected, with fewer emotional scripts to hide behind. I couldn't default to being agreeable or invisible. I had to decide what I actually wanted to share and what I didn't. At work, a new opportunity surfaced quietly during a routine meeting. A leadership training program was opening, and my manager suggested I apply. The word suggested caught me off guard. No one had ever framed advancement as something I was invited into rather than something I hustled to earn silently. My first instinct was to deflect with a joke, but I caught myself and said I'd think about it. That small pause felt unfamiliar and brave. Later that night, I sat on my couch with my laptop open to the application page. The questions weren't intimidating on the surface. Career goals, challenges, strengths. But reading the word strengths made my chest tighten. I was used to naming skills, not claiming worth. I closed the laptop twice before finally typing a few honest sentences that weren't wrapped in humor or apology. Seeing those words on the screen felt oddly exposing. When I told my mom about the program, I expected her to react with anxious caution. Instead, she surprised me again. She told me she'd be proud whether I applied or not, but she hoped I would because she'd always seen me carry more than I should alone. That sentence landed differently than similar words before. It didn't feel like pressure. It felt like permission I hadn't realized I was waiting for. Around the same time, my brother called to ask if I could watch my niece for a weekend while he attended a work conference. In the past, I would have said yes without hesitation, rearranging everything. This time, I felt a tug of conflict. The training program interviews were scheduled for that same Monday. I stared at my calendar, feeling that old reflex to sacrifice quietly rise in my chest. I told my brother the truth, that I wanted to help, but this opportunity mattered to me too. The silence on the line stretched longer than I liked. My stomach tightened, bracing for disappointment or guilt. Instead, he sighed and said he'd figure something else out. He didn't sound angry, just surprised. When we hung up, my hands shook, not from fear exactly, but from the unfamiliar feeling of choosing myself out loud. That weekend alone felt strange. The apartment was too quiet without my niece's cartoons in the background, or her sudden questions about everything. I cleaned out a closet I'd been avoiding, donating clothes I associated with old versions of myself, office outfits I wore when I tried to disappear, shoes I kept because they were practical rather than because I liked them. Each item felt like a soft goodbye to someone I no longer wanted to be. On Sunday night, before my interview, I barely slept. My thoughts weren't racing with worst-case scenarios like they usually did. Instead, I kept wondering who I would be if something finally worked out without me having to minimize it. That question felt heavier than fear. At the interview the next day, I spoke slowly, carefully choosing words that reflected me instead of what I thought they wanted to hear. That honesty felt exposed but grounding. When the acceptance email arrived 2 weeks later, I stared at it for a long time before opening it, as if delaying might soften the impact. My hands trembled as I read the word, "Congratulations." The room didn't spin. I didn't cry dramatically. I just sat on the edge of my bed, quietly stunned by the reality that something I had wanted without shrinking had actually said yes to me. I waited several hours before telling anyone. Part of me wanted to keep the feeling untouched a little longer, as if sharing it might break the spell. That evening, I called my mom. She listened in silence, then laughed softly in a way that sounded relieved rather than proud in a performative way. "You didn't disappear to get there," she said. "That's what makes it different." I hadn't realized she was paying attention. Over the next few weeks, our interactions subtly recalibrated again. She asked about the program without managing my responses. When I vented about imposter syndrome creeping in, she didn't rush to reassure me or compare me to anyone. She just listened, sometimes asking what I needed instead of assuming. That simple shift made our conversations feel lighter, like neither of us had to prove anything anymore. Meanwhile, my relationship with my brother changed too. He started looping me into family decisions instead of informing me afterward. When he needed help, he asked instead of assuming. I noticed I felt less resentful, even when I did say yes. There was a strange freedom in knowing my help was a choice now, not a role I was locked into. That difference slowly reshaped how I felt inside the family structure. One afternoon, my mom invited me over to help choose new living room furniture. In the past, that kind of errand would have felt loaded with unspoken expectations. This time, it was just two adults debating fabric textures and couch depths. When she asked what I thought, it didn't feel ceremonial. It felt like she genuinely wanted my opinion, not as a default helper, but as a person whose preferences mattered. While flipping through fabric swatches, she mentioned quietly that she had scheduled a few counseling sessions for herself. Not for me, not for the family unit, just for her. She didn't frame it as penance or self-improvement slogans. She said she wanted help understanding how fear had shaped her decisions after my sister died. Hearing that surprised me more than any apology ever had. It signaled effort that didn't depend on my reaction. That night, back in my apartment, I realized something had shifted inside me too. I no longer felt responsible for regulating my mom's emotions. I still cared deeply, but the old instinct to manage and protect her at my own expense felt weaker. I understood that empathy didn't require self-erasure. That thought didn't make me harder. It made me feel more solid, like I finally occupied my own edges. As the training program began, my schedule filled with workshops, group calls, and assignments that forced me to articulate goals I'd never admitted aloud. I talked about wanting leadership that felt grounded, rather than performative. about wanting a career that matched my values, not just my competence. Each time I spoke, my voice shook a little less. With each small act of visibility, I felt less like I was borrowing space. One evening after a particularly intense session, I called my mom, not to report success or failure, but just to talk about how tired I felt. She didn't try to fix it. She told me she was proud of how hard I was trying without burning myself out completely. That distinction mattered. It meant she was finally seeing effort without demanding endurance as proof of love. The relief of that recognition settled quietly in my chest. By late summer, it became clear that the changes in my life weren't dramatic milestones as much as steady recalibrations. I still doubted myself. I still felt old reflexes tug at me in stressful moments, but now I noticed them. I responded differently. I chose differently. And each small, quiet decision stitched together a sense of agency I had never fully trusted myself to own before. The night everything finally felt settled, I realized resolution doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives when you stop bracing for impact. Fall came in quietly, slipping between warm afternoons and cool evenings without much announcement. I walked more, taking longer routes home just to feel the air change from block to block. The trees began shedding in small, patient gestures. It mirrored how my life felt then. Nothing dramatic falling apart, just old things loosening their grip. I noticed I wasn't carrying that constant low-grade tension anymore. The absence of it felt unfamiliar, but steady. One evening, my mom invited me over for dinner without mentioning any occasion. No holiday, no task attached to it. Just dinner. The simplicity made me pause before replying, yes. When I arrived, the table was set for two, not as a statement, just as fact. We ate slowly, talking about the neighborhood, a book she'd started, an article I'd read. Our conversation wandered in a way that felt unstructured and genuinely shared. After we finished eating, she cleared the plates while I dried them at the counter. We moved around each other easily, not tiptoeing anymore. At one point, she laughed at herself for nearly burning the garlic bread, and I laughed too. It struck me how ordinary that moment was, and how rare ordinary used to feel between us. Ordinary no longer felt like a fragile truce. It felt like a foundation. Later, she brought out tea and suggested we sit in the living room. The box was still on the shelf, its presence familiar now instead of charged. We didn't open it. We didn't need to. She told me she'd had a hard counseling session that week, one where she admitted out loud how afraid she'd been of losing me after losing my sister. Hearing her say that shifted something deep and quiet in me. I told her I'd been afraid too, afraid that being strong had disqualified me from needing her. We sat with that shared fear between us like a third presence, gentle instead of sharp. There was no dramatic moment of forgiveness, just mutual acknowledgement. It felt enough. It felt like something we could actually live with instead of constantly trying to outrun or correct. On the drive home, the streetlights blurred softly against the windshield. I realized I hadn't once braced for a sudden emotional turn all evening. That used to be my instinct. Always ready for the conversation to twist into guilt or disappointment. The absence of that reflex felt like a quiet accomplishment. Not hers. Mine. It meant I trusted the present more than the old narratives I'd been repeating. Weeks later, my training program came to an end with a small closing gathering at the office. Nothing fancy. Just snacks, folding chairs, and short reflections from each participant. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't talk about resilience or leadership in polished terms. I talked about learning how to stay visible without over-explaining myself. My voice shook, but I didn't apologize for it. Afterward, my manager approached me quietly and said there would likely be a new role opening in the coming months. No promises, no guarantees, just possibility. I drove home with that word echoing in my head, not as pressure, but as space. I realized how much of my life I'd lived without space, just reaction and accommodation. The idea that something might open instead of close felt gently radical. That night, my mom called and asked how the program ended. When I told her about the possible role, she didn't launch into worry or predictions. She said she hoped I'd go for it if it felt right. The phrase, "if it feels right," lingered with me. For so long, my choices had been framed around what seemed reasonable, responsible, or least disruptive. Feeling right was never the metric. As the first cold snaps arrived, my niece started asking about Christmas again. Not with expectation, just curiosity. I realized I felt calm thinking about it this time, not defensive or wary. When my mom asked what I wanted to do, I told her I'd like to keep it small again. She agreed without hesitation. The ease of that agreement felt like a quiet victory I didn't need to announce. In early December, I found myself in my apartment placing ornaments back on the little fake tree, the same ones, the same lights. Yet the feeling was completely different. It didn't feel like preparation for survival or performance. It felt like anticipation without armor. That difference mattered more than any tradition ever had. I caught myself smiling for no reason other than I finally liked the life I was actively choosing. A few days before Christmas, my mom dropped by unexpectedly with a loaf of homemade bread and a nervous smile. She said she was trying to practice not overthinking gestures anymore. We sat at my small kitchen table, tearing warm slices and talking about nothing in particular. That casual visit would have been impossible a year ago. It didn't end with emotional collapse or a heavy conversation. It simply ended. On Christmas Day, when I arrived at her house, the air felt relaxed instead of ceremonial. There were fewer decorations, fewer plates on the counter. My brother arrived later with my niece bundled in layers, and we settled into the day without announcing expectations. No one tried to replicate old versions of us. We existed as we were now, which felt strangely more festive than any traditional script. At one point, as my niece played on the floor and my brother scrolled through photos on his phone, my mom caught my eye across the room and smiled. Not in a reconciliatory way, just a normal, content smile. I felt a soft ache in my chest, not from sadness, but from recognizing how long I'd waited to feel that unburdened in her presence. That evening, as we cleaned up together, my mom handed me a small wrapped package with my name on it. No heavy buildup, no lingering looks. Inside was a simple leather notebook. On the first page, she had written, "For everything you'll choose next." I stared at those words longer than I expected to. They felt like a blessing that didn't bind, just witnessed. Driving home that night, the streets were quiet, the sky pale with winter clouds. I thought about how much energy I'd spent over the years trying to understand what I meant to my family. The truth, I realized, was less about fixed roles and more about ongoing choices. What we said yes to. What we stopped silently carrying. What we allowed to change without demanding guarantees. In the weeks that followed, life continued in its ordinary patterns. Work deadlines, grocery lists, missed calls. But something fundamental had steadied underneath it all. I didn't feel like I was bracing for the next reveal or disappointment. I felt like I was responding to what was actually happening instead of what I feared might happen. That shift didn't make life easier. It made it truer. Sometimes I still open the notebook and hesitate before writing. Not because I don't have anything to say, but because choosing what I want now carries weight in a way it never used to. I'm no longer writing around other people's comfort. I'm writing toward my own clarity. That responsibility feels heavy at times, but it's also the kind of weight that teaches you how to stand. When I think back to the night my mom tried to ban me from Christmas, it feels less like the center of the story now, and more like the edge of a turning point. Not because it was dramatic, but because it forced a pause. A pause long enough for both of us to see the patterns we'd been living inside without naming. That pause changed everything afterward. What stays with me most is not the shock of that moment, but the slow, ordinary days that followed it. The quiet dinners, the small refusals, the permission to want without shrinking. That's where the real work happened. Not in the discovery of what was hidden, but in the choice to stop hiding myself in return.